The screen opens to the roar of the sea. Waves crash against jagged cliffs. Gulls wheel overhead, and the gray sky of the North Atlantic presses low upon the horizon. Along England's southern coast, wooden ships ride the swells, fragile silhouettes against the immensity of the ocean. Their sails billow, white against the storm-streaked heavens, as rigging groans and wind whips across the deck. From the shoreline, villagers gaze outward, their faces lit by the faint gleam of dawn. Before them lies the restless sea, the barrier, the highway, the destiny of a nation. From a small island on the edge of Europe, England turned its gaze to the horizon. What began as cautious voyages into the unknown would, in time, carry its people to every corner of the world. This is the beginning of a story both daring and transformative. How a modest kingdom, fractured by wars and bound by tradition, found its future not on the fields of its own island, but upon the uncharted waters of the great oceans. The age of discovery beyond England. The 15th to 17th centuries marked an upheaval in human history, a time when the world itself seemed to expand. This was the age of discovery, when ships no longer hugged familiar coasts but plunged into open seas, tracing invisible paths toward new continents. With compass and astrolabe, with courage and ambition, European sailors rewrote the map of the earth. The first to leap into this vast unknown were the Iberian powers. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator, sent caravels south along the coast of Africa, probing routes to India and the riches of the East. In 1492, Spain funded the audacious voyage of Christopher Columbus, whose landfall in the Caribbean would open an era of conquest and colonization across the Americas. Soon after, Magellan's fleet circumnavigated the globe, proving that the oceans were not boundaries but bridges. Gold, silver, and spices flowed back to Iberia. Empires stretched across oceans. Spain and Portugal divided the world between them in the Treaty of Tordesillas, imagining that they alone could command the seas. But even as they carved their global dominion, other nations, watchful, restless, hungry, prepared to challenge their monopoly. Among these challengers was a realm often overlooked, the Kingdom of England. England at the threshold. In the late 15th century, England was hardly the maritime titan it would one day become. Emerging from the Wars of the Roses, its monarchy under Henry VII was preoccupied with stability at home rather than conquest abroad. The kingdom was modest in size, its resources limited compared to the Golden Flood enriching Spain. Yet geography gave England a peculiar advantage. Surrounded by sea, every invasion in its history had come across water. To survive, the English had learned to build ships, to navigate channels and tides, to live in rhythm with the ocean. The sea was both shield and stage, both prison and promise. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, sighted the shores of Newfoundland. It was a brief, uncertain venture, overshadowed by Columbus's triumph. Still, Cabot's landfall would linger in England's memory, proof that beyond the horizon lay not just myth, but opportunity. For decades, England's ambitions remained cautious. Domestic politics, religious upheavals, and continental wars drew its attention inward. But beneath the surface, a maritime spirit was gathering. Dockyards expanded, shipwrights refined their craft, and merchants dreamed of markets beyond the narrow seas. The turning tide toward Elizabeth's England. The 16th century would bring a queen whose reign altered England's relationship with the sea. Elizabeth I. Her England was not the richest, nor the largest, but it was daring. Faced with a Catholic superpower, Spain, that commanded oceans, Elizabeth embraced a strategy born of necessity and audacity. She encouraged private enterprise, granting licenses to privateers, men who sailed not only to trade but to plunder Spanish treasure fleets. The sea became England's battlefield, its merchants and mariners doubling as warriors. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh emerged. Sailors, adventurers, sometimes outlaws, who carried England's flag far beyond its coasts. They embodied the paradox of the age. Part explorers, part raiders, part visionaries. Their voyages were fueled by profit and faith, ambition and survival. Elizabeth's navy, strengthened by innovation in ship design, would stand against the greatest fleet in Europe. The Spanish Armada of 1588. When the storm and fire of that summer scattered Spain's might, England was transformed. No longer merely an island kingdom, it had become a rising sea power. The defeat of the Armada was not an end, but a beginning. Commerce, colonies, and empire to be. Out of this crucible of conflict emerged something larger, the idea that England's destiny lay overseas. The foundation of the Muscovy Company, the East India Company, and early attempts at colonies in North America signaled a new era, the search for wealth intertwined with the spread of faith and the hunger for land. From the Atlantic coast of America to the harbors of India, English merchants sought footholds that would, over centuries, grow into the far-reaching British Empire. But the age of exploration was not only about ambition, it was about transformation of England itself and of the wider world. Contact with distant lands would spark exchange and upheaval, goods, ideas, and cultures converging across oceans, often with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. It was an age of opportunity and exploitation, of wonder and violence, of beginnings whose legacy still shapes the modern world. The central question, thus the stage is set. From a modest kingdom cautious in its first steps, England would become a formidable player in the great game of exploration and empire. The Iberian powers had led the way, but in the centuries to come, it would be England's ships, its merchants, its soldiers, and its settlers who would carry the island's influence to every continent. How did a small island kingdom, once a minor player on Europe's stage, become the heart of a global empire? How did its sailors, merchants, and monarchs transform the age of discovery into the age of English expansion? England's white cliffs fading into the distance as ships sailed toward the horizon, their masts etched against the setting sun. The story begins here. The age of exploration, when England first turned outward, and the world would never be the same. Medieval legacy and the turning point of the Renaissance. The story of England's rise upon the seas cannot begin with sails alone. Before the ships and explorers, before merchants and colonies, there lay centuries of turmoil that forged the kingdom itself. To understand England's leap into the age of exploration, one must first return to the shadows of its medieval past. The 15th century dawned with England still locked in the final throes of the 100 Years' War against France. For generations, armies had marched across fields from Normandy to Gascony, carrying banners stitched with lions and lilies. Castles smoldered, villages emptied, and treasure drained into endless campaigns. Yet, as the war ground to its weary end in 1453, England stood not triumphant, but exhausted. Its claim to French lands was shattered. Calais was all that remained of once grand ambitions. The kingdom turned inward, wounded and weary. From that wound came deeper conflict. Rival branches of the royal house, Lancaster and York, contested the throne in a brutal dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades, England's destiny swung between red rose and white. Kings were crowned and cast down in rapid succession. Noble houses rose to glory or fell into ruin. The kingdom bled not only in battle, but in uncertainty. Who would rule? And what future would that rule bring? When the smoke of civil war finally cleared, a new dynasty emerged, the Tudors. Henry VII seized the crown in 1485 and brought a fragile stability to his realm. He was cautious, pragmatic, and determined to strengthen the monarchy after a century of weakness. His reign marked a quiet turning point. The soil of England, long scarred by feudal wars, began to settle. From that soil, new ambitions would one day grow. Beyond the island's shores, however, Europe itself was changing in ways that would transform every kingdom, England included. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning, art, and human curiosity. From Florence and Venice spread ideas that reawakened Europe's imagination. Scholars rediscovered the texts of Greece and Rome. Painters filled canvases with light and perspective. Architects raised domes that touched the heavens. England, though distant from the Mediterranean, was not immune to this tide. Printing presses clattered in London, spreading books and maps, stories of ancient voyages and new discoveries. Universities stirred with fresh debates on science, mathematics, and philosophy. The very act of looking outward, toward knowledge, toward the world, became a cultural force. A kingdom that had once been consumed by civil feuds began to lift its eyes to broader horizons. Yet the Renaissance alone did not set England on its path. Alongside it came the thunder of religious upheaval, the Reformation. Across Europe, faith was torn and remade. Martin Luther nailed his theses in Wittenberg. Debates on scripture and salvation swept across Christendom. Monarchs and commoners alike were forced to choose sides. In England, the question of religion would become the question of sovereignty itself. Henry VIII, son of Henry VII, broke with Rome in the 1530s, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. What began as a king's quarrel with the Pope over marriage would echo for centuries. Monasteries dissolved, altars stripped, doctrines rewritten. The island's faith, long bound to Rome, was severed. With it came both upheaval and opportunity. The Church's vast wealth flowed into the crown's coffers. Authority shifted from pope to monarch, giving English kings and queens new power to shape their nation's destiny. The combined force of Renaissance thought and Reformation fervor ignited a new spirit in England. The Renaissance gave curiosity, the Reformation gave defiance. Together, they created a mindset restless and bold, one no longer content to accept the world as it was, but eager to reshape it. In the taverns of London and Bristol, sailors whispered of lands across the Atlantic. In courtly chambers, advisors urged monarchs to seek trade beyond Europe. In universities and workshops, men sketched ships with stronger hulls, drew maps of oceans yet untraveled, imagined possibilities once unthinkable. The England that had been fractured by roses and lilies, scarred by foreign wars, now stood at the threshold of reinvention. From the ashes of medieval conflict rose a kingdom hungry for renewal. The Renaissance sharpened its mind. The Reformation hardened its resolve. England was no longer merely surviving, it was preparing. And as the 16th century unfolded, its gaze would turn outward to seas uncharted and horizons unknown. Monasteries fall to ruin, their stones carried away, while in nearby dockyards new ships rise from fresh timbers. Old faith crumbles, and new ambition builds. From the turbulence of the past, a new England takes shape, an England ready to claim its place in the age of exploration. While England was healing from civil strife and preparing for renewal beyond its shores, the oceans were already being transformed. The Iberian kingdoms had seized the initiative, proving that seas once seen as boundaries could become pathways of empire. The rise of European seafaring's England emerged from its medieval struggles. Other nations were already reshaping the map of the world. Long before the sails of Drake or Raleigh cut across the oceans, the initiative belonged to the Iberian kingdoms. Portugal and Spain, perched on the edge of Europe with their gaze fixed upon the Atlantic, became the pioneers of an age in which seas were no longer boundaries, but pathways to power. It was Portugal that first seized the winds of change. Small in territory yet ambitious in spirit, Portugal turned outward under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator. In the 15th century, Portuguese caravels traced the outline of Africa's western coast, venturing further with each passing decade. The invention of new ship designs, nimble enough to tack against the wind, and the careful application of maps and compasses made possible what earlier mariners had feared: voyages far from sight of land. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the stormy southern tip of Africa. His voyage, though forced to turn back before reaching India, proved that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. A decade later, Vasco da Gama carried Portuguese ambitions to their triumph. In 1498, he reached Calicut on the western coast of India, opening a direct sea route to the riches of the East. Spices, silks, and precious goods could now flow to Europe without passing through the hands of Ottoman or Venetian middlemen. The balance of commerce shifted, and Portugal, once a marginal kingdom, stood at the heart of a global trade network. Spain, Portugal's rival and neighbor, would answer with conquests of its own. In 1492, the same year Granada fell and the Reconquista ended, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund the daring plan of an Italian mariner, Christopher Columbus. Sailing west with 3 small ships, he sought a shortcut to Asia, but instead found the islands of the Caribbean. Though he never reached the Indies he imagined, his voyage opened the door to a new world. Lands unknown to Europeans, rich, vast, and peopled with civilizations of their own, entered the orbit of Iberian ambition. The consequences multiplied quickly. Spanish conquistadors, armed with determination and a sense of divine mission, pressed deeper into the Americas. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Francisco Pizarro subdued the Inca in Peru. Meanwhile, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, though Magellan himself did not survive the journey, achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe between 1519 and 1522. The voyage demonstrated both the scale of the Earth and the possibility of truly global travel. From Africa to the Americas to Asia, Iberian ships carried not only goods, but also languages, religions, and empires. Gold and silver from the mines of the New World poured into Spanish coffers, fueling a century of power that made Spain the foremost kingdom in Europe. Portuguese forts dotted the African coast, the Indian Ocean, and beyond, creating a chain of maritime outposts that ensured their supremacy over the spice trade. The rivalry between these two seafaring nations became so intense that it threatened to plunge Europe into perpetual conflict. To prevent war, the Pope brokered a division of the world in 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic Ocean. Lands to the west would fall under Spanish dominion, those to the east to Portugal. On parchment, the world was neatly split. In reality, the line ignored the ambitions of other kingdoms, France, the Dutch Republic, and eventually England, who would not remain spectators forever. The seas had been claimed, but not secured. A line on a map could not hold back the tides of human ambition, for now the Iberians reigned supreme. Their ships commanded the oceans, their coffers swelled with bullion, and their monarchs dreamed of universal empire, yet their very dominance stirred envy and rivalry. Observers across Europe watched Spain and Portugal grow rich beyond measure and wondered, why not us? In England, merchants and sailors took note. The voyages of Cabot had shown what was possible. The stories of Columbus and da Gama proved what was at stake. Though England in the 15th century lacked the resources to rival Iberia, the lesson was clear. Whoever mastered the seas would command not only wealth, but destiny. Thus, even before England built its empire, the stage had been set. Portugal and Spain had unveiled a new world order. Oceans as highways, continents as prizes, and exploration as the currency of power. England's time had not yet come, but its gaze was already turning outward, toward horizons shaped by Iberian sails. While the Iberian powers carved up the oceans and filled their coffers with silver and spice, England remained on the margins, an island still recovering from civil strife, yet slowly awakening to the possibility that the sea might one day be its destiny. England's position before entering the game. Compared to the great Iberian powers, England of the late 15th and early 16th centuries seemed an unlikely contender for global influence. It was, above all, an island kingdom, protected by surrounding seas, yet constrained by them. Its population was modest compared to France or Spain, its finances limited, and its reach confined. While galleons laden with silver sailed into Seville and Lisbon, England remained a peripheral power, still recovering from centuries of conflict. Geography, however, shaped its destiny. The sea was both shield and horizon. Throughout its history, invaders had always come by water: Romans, Saxons, Vikings, Normans. Survival had demanded a knowledge of tides, coasts, and ships. Though England lacked the wealth of Iberia, it possessed seafaring traditions rooted in necessity. The ocean was not just a barrier. It was a stage upon which England might, one day, play its part. But in the 15th century, England's energies were directed inward. The Wars of the Roses had torn the kingdom apart, with rival houses of Lancaster and York locked in bitter struggle. For decades, dynastic conflict consumed the nobility, drained resources, and weakened central authority. The crown itself seemed fragile, as kings rose and fell through intrigue and battle. In such conditions, thoughts of distant seas and new worlds were far from the realm's priority. The turning point came with the rise of the Tudors. In 1485, Henry VII secured the throne at Bosworth and brought an end to the dynastic chaos. His reign marked the beginning of stability. Careful with finances, pragmatic in policy, Henry restored order to the monarchy and set the foundations for stronger governance. Though cautious in foreign affairs, he did authorize voyages such as John Cabot's expedition of 1497, which reached Newfoundland. This early venture revealed both possibility and limitation. England could explore, but it lacked the resources to sustain expansion on the scale of Spain or Portugal. Henry VIII, his son, inherited a kingdom more secure and ambitious. His reign is often remembered for religious upheaval, but it was also significant for maritime development. Henry invested in dockyards at Deptford and Woolwich, commissioned new warships such as the Mary Rose, and established the beginnings of a permanent navy. While these ships were built largely for defense against France and Scotland, they also laid the groundwork for future expeditions. For the first time, England began to think of itself not merely as an island with ships, but as a nation with a navy. Yet the limits remained clear. England's treasury was not overflowing with bullion like Spain's. Its merchants did not yet command the networks of the Portuguese. Domestic politics, religious division, dynastic succession, and relations with powerful neighbors occupied much of the crown's attention. To most observers in Europe, England appeared a secondary power, important in regional struggles, but far from decisive in the wider world. And yet, beneath the surface, change was stirring. The Tudor monarchy's consolidation created the stability necessary for ambition. The break with Rome under Henry VIII severed the kingdom from papal authority, but it also fostered a sense of independence and destiny. The Protestant Reformation bound England to broader currents of European change, aligning it with reformist powers and setting it apart from Catholic Spain. A distinct identity was emerging, an island nation conscious of its separation and increasingly willing to test its strength. For merchants and mariners, the lesson of Iberia was unmistakable. They saw ships return laden with treasures, ports enriched by new trade, monarchs strengthened by overseas wealth. England could not ignore such transformations. Though cautious at first, voices began to call for ventures abroad, for footholds in the Americas, and for a share of the lucrative spice trade. The resources were limited, but the vision was expanding. Thus, on the eve of the great Elizabethan age, England stood at a threshold. No longer distracted by civil war, more stable under the Tudors, and more conscious of its maritime potential, the kingdom was preparing to step onto the stage of world exploration. It was not yet the empire it would become, but the foundations were laid. An island nation, modest in means yet rich in resilience, ready to test the waters of global rivalry. The story of England's rise was not one of sudden wealth or overwhelming might, but of gradual transformation. Its people had endured war, its rulers had restored stability, and its seas had shaped their character. In a world where oceans were becoming the new frontiers, England's island position was no longer a limitation. It was a calling. That calling first took shape under Henry VII, whose cautious yet deliberate policies marked England's earliest steps onto the waters of exploration. Henry VII and the First Maritime Policies. When Henry VII secured the throne in 1485, his primary mission was stability. England had been torn apart by decades of civil strife, and the new Tudor king understood that reckless ventures abroad could threaten the fragile balance he had restored. His policies were pragmatic, measured, and deeply cautious. Yet within this caution lay the seeds of England's first tentative steps into the wider world. Henry recognized that commerce was a safer path to wealth than war. Unlike continental monarchs who poured resources into vast armies, he turned to merchants, craftsmen, and the rising towns of his realm. Trade agreements were carefully negotiated to restore English markets in Europe, especially the wool trade that underpinned the kingdom's economy. Prosperity, not conquest, was Henry's goal. Still, the example of Iberia could not be ignored. Portugal and Spain were reaping fortunes from their voyages. The idea that England might share in such opportunities lingered at the edge of policy. It was in this context that Henry VII gave his cautious support to John Cabot, a Venetian navigator living in Bristol. Cabot persuaded the king that a westward voyage might uncover a northern route to Asia, bypassing the Portuguese monopoly around Africa. The king, careful with his treasury, did not commit vast sums. Instead, he granted Cabot letters patent in 1496, allowing him to discover, find, and investigate new lands in the name of the English crown. Funding would come largely from Bristol merchants rather than the royal coffers. In May 1497, Cabot set sail with a small crew aboard the Matthew. Weeks later, he sighted land, almost certainly the coast of Newfoundland. The details remain obscure. The records are fragmentary, yet the significance was immense. Cabot had reached North America under the English flag, only 5 years after Columbus had reached the Caribbean. To Henry VII, the voyage offered prestige at little cost. Symbolic entry into the contest for the New World. Cabot returned to England claiming vast fisheries and new lands for the crown. Enthusiasm spread in Bristol, where merchants imagined trade in cod, furs, and perhaps even access to Asia. Henry rewarded Cabot with a modest pension and prepared to back further voyages. But Cabot's second expedition in 1498 vanished into the Atlantic, leaving no trace. The dream for the moment dissolved into silence. The episode revealed both the possibilities and the limits of Henry's England. On the one hand, it showed that English sailors could indeed reach new continents, placing the kingdom within the unfolding drama of exploration. On the other, it demonstrated the fragility of such efforts. England lacked the resources, ships, and sustained royal commitment to match Spain or Portugal. While the Iberians built empires, England's ventures remained brief flashes, promising but uncertain. Henry VII himself never pressed the matter further. His priorities remained domestic, securing dynastic succession, managing finances, and ensuring peace. Exploration was not abandoned, but neither was it pursued with urgency. Cabot's landfall in Newfoundland would echo faintly in memory, but it did not yet transform the kingdom's destiny. Still, the implications were lasting. Cabot's voyage gave England a theoretical claim to parts of North America, a claim that would be remembered in later centuries when colonization took firmer shape. It also set a precedent. Monarchs could authorize merchants and private adventurers to sail in the name of the crown without risking the full expense of the treasury. This partnership between the state and private enterprise would become a hallmark of England's imperial strategy. Henry VII's reign thus occupies a paradoxical place in the story of exploration. He was cautious, pragmatic, and never intended to launch a global empire. Yet under his rule, England first touched the shores of a new continent. What he began in careful, almost hesitant fashion would, under his successors, grow into a tidal wave of ambition. England was not yet ready to compete with Iberia. Its navy was small, its finances limited, its political focus inward, but the spark had been struck. In the quiet port of Bristol, in the modest voyage of a Venetian mariner, lay the faint outline of a future empire. If Henry VII had struck the first cautious spark, it was his son, Henry VIII, who fanned it into flame, transforming England's hesitant experiments into the beginnings of a true naval tradition. Henry VIII and the rise of the Navy. The cautious steps of Henry VII gave way to a new kind of monarch, one more assertive, ambitious, and eager to display power. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited a stable kingdom, but also a modest navy. For the young king, the sea was not only a means of defense, but also a stage upon which England could project its strength. Under his reign, the foundations of a true naval tradition began to take shape. Henry VIII's personality was bold and restless. He admired the grandeur of continental monarchs and sought to match their influence. France and Spain dominated Europe, both on land and sea, and Henry believed that England too must command respect. To achieve this, he turned to the Navy. Unlike his father, who had invested minimally in overseas ventures, Henry saw the fleet as a symbol of prestige and a necessary tool of sovereignty. Early in his reign, he invested heavily in shipbuilding. At Woolwich and Deptford, royal dockyards were established, permanent centers dedicated to the construction and maintenance of warships. These were not temporary facilities, but lasting institutions, ensuring that England could sustain a fleet year after year. The king also introduced administrative reforms, creating the Navy Board to oversee logistics, supplies, and wages. For the first time, the Navy began to emerge as a professional branch of government rather than a temporary levy of merchant vessels. Henry's most famous commission was the Mary Rose, launched in 1511. Sleek, powerful, and armed with heavy cannon, it represented a new era in naval design. Unlike earlier ships built primarily for boarding and hand-to-hand combat, the Mary Rose was conceived as a floating fortress, capable of delivering broadsides against enemy vessels. Its construction marked England's entry into the age of gunpowder navies, where artillery would decide battles as much as sails and seamanship. The Navy grew quickly. By the middle of Henry's reign, England possessed more than 50 warships, a fleet remarkable in size for a kingdom of its means. The Solent, the Thames, and the Medway bustled with activity as carpenters, sailmakers, and gunners sustained the king's maritime ambitions. For the first time, the notion of England as a seafaring power had institutional reality. Henry's wars with France and Scotland provided the Navy with purpose. The fleet was used to raid French ports, to defend the Channel, and to support land campaigns. Naval engagements were often indecisive, but the very act of deploying large fleets asserted England's presence. Even when victories were elusive, the message was clear. England was no longer a passive island, but an active maritime participant in European conflicts. The Reformation further reinforced Henry's naval policy. Breaking with Rome in the 1530s, Henry anticipated hostility from Catholic powers. A strong navy was the shield of a kingdom that could no longer rely on papal approval or continental alliances. Ships became not only military instruments, but also symbols of independence. In the age of religious division, the fleet was England's guarantee of survival. Yet limitations remained. England's resources could not match those of Spain, enriched by the silver of the Americas, nor Portugal with its spice routes. Henry's fleet was impressive but expensive, and its maintenance strained the royal treasury. Much of the activity was defensive, designed to protect the island rather than launch ambitious overseas expeditions. The Navy was a beginning, not yet a tool of empire. Still, the transformation under Henry VIII was profound. He had turned England from a realm with ships into a realm with a navy. Dockyards, administration, and artillery ships would endure as legacies for future monarchs, though his reign did not bring lasting conquests overseas. It established the infrastructure without which later expansion would have been impossible. The sinking of the Mary Rose in 1545 during battle with the French was a tragedy, but also a symbol. The ship that had embodied Henry's ambitions went down in the Solent, a reminder of the risks of maritime power. Yet even in loss, it represented progress. England had committed itself to the sea, and there would be no turning back. By the time Henry died in 1547, he left behind not merely a kingdom stabilized, but one increasingly defined by its naval identity. The fleet he had built, though costly, gave England the confidence to face its rivals. In the decades to follow, his successors would inherit not only ships and dockyards, but a vision that England's destiny lay across the waves. Henry VIII's reign thus marked the transition from tentative experiments to structural commitment. Where Henry VII had been cautious, Henry VIII was assertive. Where his father had sponsored a single Venetian mariner, the son created a navy capable of standing against Europe's greatest powers. It was a bold, imperfect, and unfinished beginning, but it was the beginning nonetheless of England's rise as a maritime nation. Yet even as Henry VIII forged the Navy into a lasting institution, the spirit of overseas exploration remained hesitant, its earliest flame still tied to the fading legacy of John Cabot. John Cabot's legacy and the slow march of early English exploration. The voyages of John Cabot had opened a door, but in the decades that followed, England failed to walk through it. Newfoundland remained a distant memory, recorded in fragments, celebrated briefly, then set aside. Unlike Spain, which poured treasure and soldiers into the Americas, or Portugal, which fortified its spice routes in Asia, England's overseas ventures remained sporadic and hesitant. The reasons were clear. England was still a kingdom of limited means. Its treasury could not sustain fleets across oceans, and its rulers faced constant demands closer to home. The Tudor monarchy was focused on consolidation, religion, and rivalry with France and Scotland. Exploration was a possibility, but not yet a priority. Still, Cabot's voyages left behind an idea that England had touched the New World first among northern Europeans, and that this contact could, in time, become a claim. Fishermen from Bristol and the West Country quietly continued to sail to the North Atlantic. Cod from the rich waters of Newfoundland began to appear in English markets, traded alongside herring and other staples. These private ventures were not grand expeditions, but they kept alive the memory that opportunities lay across the ocean. Under Henry VIII, naval investment was directed more toward defense and war in Europe than discovery. Yet even in this period, individuals dreamed of more. Sebastian Cabot, John's son, attempted to build on his father's legacy. He sailed in Spanish service, mapped parts of South America, and sought a passage to Asia through the north. Though his achievements were scattered, they reflected a continuing thread. The English, though not yet ready, remained connected to the currents of exploration sweeping across Europe. But while Iberian ships returned laden with silver, England's coffers saw little from such ventures. The wealth of empire flowed south, feeding Spanish armies and Portuguese merchants. England looked on with envy, but lacked the power to intervene. The Treaty of Tordesillas had given Spain and Portugal a supposed monopoly over new lands, blessed by papal authority. For decades, England accepted its place at the margins. The mid-16th century brought further delay. Edward VI's short reign was consumed by religious upheaval and internal challenges. Mary I, in turn, married Philip of Spain and aligned England temporarily with Iberian power, leaving little room for independent maritime ambition. Exploration seemed stalled, overshadowed by the storms of dynastic and religious politics. Yet the world was changing too quickly for England to remain idle forever. The Protestant Reformation deepened rivalries, and the riches of the New World made Spain a formidable power. For many English observers, this dominance was a provocation. Why should one kingdom claim entire continents? Why should oceans be closed by lines on a papal map? Even in times of caution, English seafarers tested boundaries. Voyages sought a northern passage around Russia and toward Asia, leading to the creation of the Muscovy Company in 1555. Trade with Russia and the Baltic was not empire, but it marked an extension of English horizons. Merchants and investors began to see exploration not as reckless adventurism, but as calculated opportunity. The legacy of John Cabot lingered as both inspiration and challenge. His brief triumph in 1497 showed what was possible, but the failure to build upon it revealed England's weakness. For half a century, the kingdom had remained a spectator while others claimed the riches of the world. But the seeds were planted. The vision of crossing oceans, of finding new routes and new markets, was never extinguished. By the mid-16th century, England was gathering the elements it would need. A navy established under Henry VIII, a merchant class increasingly assertive, and a population restless with religious and political change. The nation had not yet embraced full-scale exploration, but the foundation was forming. When the right moment came, when opportunity and necessity aligned, England would step forward with determination. The slow march of early exploration was less about failure than preparation. England learned caution while Spain and Portugal overextended. It studied from the sidelines while others fought, conquered, and exhausted themselves. And when the time came, it would claim its place. The story of Cabot and the hesitant decades that followed is thus not a tale of lost chances, but of gestation. England remained a modest power, uncertain, but already turning its eyes outward. The spark had not yet become a flame, but it smoldered, waiting for the wind that would one day carry English ships across every ocean. That wind came with Elizabeth I, whose reign turned England's smoldering ambitions into a blaze upon the seas. Elizabeth I and the maritime policy. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom both fragile and poised for transformation. The decades before her reign had been consumed by religious conflict, dynastic uncertainty, and uneasy alliances. England was not yet a great power, but under Elizabeth's rule, the sea would become the arena through which the nation forged its identity and tested its strength. Elizabeth understood England's limitations. The treasury was modest, the army small, and the realms surrounded by larger, wealthier rivals. To confront Spain directly on land was impossible, but at sea, where ingenuity and courage could compensate for numbers, England might find advantage. Thus, the Queen and her advisors crafted a strategy that was both pragmatic and daring. Rather than fund vast expeditions from the Crown's limited resources, they turned to private enterprise. Merchants, adventurers, and seafarers were granted licenses to sail under the English flag. These letters of marque allowed privateers to attack the ships of hostile powers, particularly Spain, while sharing their profits with investors and the Crown. It was a system of semi-official piracy, cloaked in legality, that blurred the line between commerce and war. To Elizabeth, it was an elegant solution. England could harass its enemies, disrupt Spanish treasure fleets, and expand its maritime experience, all without draining the royal treasury. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and later Sir Walter Raleigh became the embodiment of this policy. They were merchants and warriors, explorers and raiders, operating in a world where the ocean was both a battlefield and a marketplace. Their ships crossed the Atlantic, intercepted galleons, and returned with treasure. They carried the risks of private adventure, but also served the broader aims of the Crown. Spain, enriched by the silver of the Americas, was the foremost power in Europe. Its king, Philip II, commanded territories that stretched from the Low Countries to the New World, from the Mediterranean to the Philippines. To challenge such a power seemed reckless. Yet Elizabeth's England did so with a mixture of audacity and necessity. The sea became the stage where this unequal contest would unfold. In the 1560s, Hawkins began voyages to West Africa and the Caribbean, intruding upon Spain's colonial monopoly. These ventures were commercial in aim but openly provocative, for Spain claimed exclusive rights to trade in its overseas possessions. When Spanish authorities resisted, clashes erupted. England and Spain were not formally at war, but the conflict at sea had already begun. Drake carried the struggle further. In the 1570s, he circumnavigated the globe, striking Spanish outposts in the Pacific and returning to England with vast spoils. His exploits made him a hero at home and a menace in Madrid. For Spain, these privateers were pirates. For England, they were patriots expanding the realm's influence. Elizabeth herself, cautious yet shrewd, publicly denied sanction while privately profiting from the results. Through these ventures, the sea became England's proving ground. Battles were fought not only with cannon, but with maps, compasses, and strategy. English seamen learned the strengths of their ships, the importance of speed and maneuverability, and the value of striking suddenly against a wealthier adversary. The rivalry with Spain escalated as political and religious tensions deepened. Elizabeth's Protestant England stood against Philip II's Catholic Empire, and the conflict of faith was matched by the contest for oceans. By the 1580s, it was clear that the struggle was not temporary, but existential. Control of the seas meant survival, and survival meant daring. Elizabeth's policy transformed England. What had once been a cautious island realm became a nation of adventurers. The Queen's calculated embrace of private enterprise turned piracy into statecraft, commerce into war. In doing so, she laid the foundations for a maritime tradition that would outlast her reign. England was still far from empire. Its resources were limited, its colonies tentative, and its future uncertain. But in Elizabeth's time, the kingdom discovered its element. The sea was not merely a boundary, it was a weapon, a stage, and a future. Against Spain, against odds, England found the beginnings of its identity as a naval power, and in no figure was this new spirit more fully embodied than in Francis Drake, whose voyages turned Elizabeth's policy into legend. Sir Francis Drake and the spirit of adventure. Among the many seafarers who sailed under Elizabeth's reign, none embodied the daring of the age more vividly than Sir Francis Drake. His name became legend in his own lifetime, admired by his countrymen, feared by his enemies, and remembered as the very image of England's restless ambition upon the sea. Drake's rise was born of the turbulent world Elizabeth had shaped. Granted the authority of privateering, he sailed not as an agent of reckless piracy, but as a man licensed to challenge Spain's dominance. For Spain, he was a marauder. For England, he was a patriot, striking blows against a rival empire that claimed oceans as its own. His exploits blurred the line between war and commerce, adventure and strategy, yet each voyage added to the growing sense that England was destined for greatness upon the waters. His most audacious journey began in 1577, when Elizabeth secretly sanctioned him to sail into the Pacific, an ocean Spain considered its private preserve. With 5 ships, Drake departed from Plymouth, his true mission cloaked in secrecy. Officially, he sought new trade routes. In reality, he aimed to raid Spanish holdings along the Pacific coast, a daring enterprise no Englishman had attempted before. The voyage tested endurance as much as skill. Storms battered the fleet as it passed through the treacherous Strait of Magellan. Mutiny threatened, supplies ran low. Yet Drake pressed forward, commanding his men with determination. Only one ship, the Golden Hind, completed the passage into the Pacific, but from that moment, Drake's legend was assured. In waters Spain believed untouchable, he struck with speed and precision. Spanish galleons, heavy with silver and gold, fell into his hands. Coastal towns were raided, their treasure seized. Each success sent shockwaves through the empire of Philip II. How could an English captain with a single ship pierce the heart of Spain's oceanic monopoly? Drake continued northward along the Pacific coast, reaching as far as present-day California, which he claimed for England and named Nova Albion. Though the claim was little more than symbolic, it reflected the widening scope of English horizons. The world was no longer bounded by Europe's coasts. Oceans themselves had become England's future frontier. From the Pacific, Drake sailed westward across the vast ocean, crossing the Spice Islands and navigating around the Cape of Good Hope. In September 1580, after nearly 3 years at sea, the Golden Hind returned to Plymouth. Drake had circumnavigated the globe, only the second expedition in history to achieve the feat, and the first to return with such immense profit. The voyage was more than a triumph of navigation. It was a challenge hurled at Spain's supremacy, a demonstration that the oceans could not be monopolized by one crown. When Drake knelt before Elizabeth and she knighted him aboard the Golden Hind, the act carried symbolism as potent as any battle. It was a declaration that England had joined the ranks of global seafaring powers. The treasure he brought back was staggering. Gold, silver, and spices filled English coffers, strengthening the crown and enriching investors. Yet the greatest prize was not material, it was confidence. For the first time, England had proof that its mariners could rival the greatest seafarers of Europe. The island kingdom was no longer a bystander. Drake became more than a captain. He became a symbol. To his fellow Englishmen, he embodied resilience, daring, and the refusal to bow before Spain's might. Ballads were sung in his honor, stories spread of his courage and cunning. To the wider world, he was proof that England's time upon the seas had come. Of course, his actions deep intentions with Spain. Each raid, each captured galleon, inflamed Philip II's resolve to subdue England. Drake's triumphs, celebrated in London, were curses in Madrid. The stage was being set for open war, but in the meantime, his voyages carved out England's place in the age of discovery and rivalry. The circumnavigation of 1577 to 1580 was not only a journey around the world, it was a turning point in England's imagination. The seas were no longer Spain's domain, nor were they barriers to England's ambitions. They were pathways, open and inviting, where courage could reshape history. In Drake's figure, England glimpsed its own destiny, a small nation on the edge of Europe, daring to reach beyond horizons, challenging empires, and finding in the ocean not limitation, but freedom. If Drake proved that England could challenge Spain upon the seas, Raleigh sought to prove that it could endure upon new shores. Sir Walter Raleigh and the dream of settlement. If Francis Drake embodied the daring of the sea, Sir Walter Raleigh represented the imagination of settlement. Where Drake raided and returned with treasure, Raleigh dreamed of planting England itself across the ocean. His vision was not only of ships and spoils, but of towns, farms, and lasting presence. It was an ambition that would prove elusive in his lifetime, yet it planted the idea that England's destiny lay not only in crossing the seas, but in inhabiting new worlds. Raleigh rose swiftly in Elizabeth's favor. Handsome, eloquent, and ambitious, he became one of the Queen's closest courtiers. But he was not content with courtly life alone. He believed that England must establish colonies to rival Spain's empire. While Spain drew wealth from Mexico and Peru, and Portugal controlled trade in Africa and Asia, England had yet to secure a permanent foothold beyond Europe. Raleigh intended to change that. In 1584, Elizabeth granted him a royal charter to explore and colonize lands in North America not already claimed by Christian powers. Raleigh envisioned settlements that would expand England's reach, provide bases for trade and privateering, and offer a counterbalance to Spanish influence in the New World. He chose the region of present-day North Carolina, naming it Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. The first expedition, launched in 1585 under Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane, established a colony on Roanoke Island. At first, the settlers were hopeful. They built fortifications, mapped the coast, and sought relations with local tribes. But the challenges were immense. Supplies dwindled, relations with native peoples grew strained, and the settlers faced hunger and isolation. Within a year, the colony faltered. When Francis Drake arrived in 1586 after his Caribbean raids, he offered them passage home, and the survivors abandoned Roanoke. Undeterred, Raleigh sponsored a second attempt in 1587, this time led by John White. Families joined the expedition, signaling the intent to build a true community rather than a mere outpost. White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, became the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of hope for the future. Yet once again, circumstances proved harsh. White returned to England to seek supplies, but when he finally managed to sail back in 1590, he found the settlement deserted. Houses stood empty, and the word Croatoan was carved into a post. The fate of the lost colony remains one of history's enduring mysteries. For Raleigh, the failure was costly. Critics mocked the abandoned settlements, and Spain scorned England's attempts. Yet, in another sense, Roanoke was not a failure at all. It revealed the magnitude of the challenge, but it also marked the first serious attempt by England to plant its people across the Atlantic. The dream of settlement was alive, and though deferred, it would not be forgotten. The story of Roanoke resonated deeply in England. The image of a vanished colony stirred both caution and determination. It showed that exploration was not enough. Endurance was required, and colonies demanded patience, resources, and resilience. In the years to come, when Jamestown and Plymouth were founded, they would do so in the shadow of Roanoke's lessons. Raleigh himself remained an emblem of ambition. He sponsored voyages, pursued schemes of exploration in South America, and continued to advocate for colonization. His career rose and fell with the tides of court politics, but his legacy endured, not in personal triumph, but in the vision he inspired. To dream of England across the ocean was to think beyond raids and trade, to imagine a future where the nation would replicate itself in distant lands. Though Roanoke vanished, the idea it represented was indelible. England had glimpsed a new role for itself, not just as a challenger of Spanish fleets, but as a settler of continents. Raleigh's colony may have been lost, but the vision it symbolized would return, stronger than before, in the century to come. Yet before England could fulfill Raleigh's vision of settlement, it first had to survive a reckoning with Spain itself, the clash that came with the Armada of 1588. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, 1588. By the late 1580s, the simmering rivalry between England and Spain erupted into open confrontation. For decades, tensions had grown. Elizabeth's support of Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, the raids of privateers like Francis Drake, and the symbolic affront of English defiance against papal authority. To Philip II of Spain, England had become a dangerous irritant, a rebellious island that undermined Catholic order and threatened the flow of treasure from the New World. In 1588, he resolved to act. The might of Spain would be sent against England in the form of an armada, an invincible fleet, the largest naval force Europe had yet seen. The Armada was a monumental undertaking, over 130 ships manned by some 30,000 sailors and soldiers gathered in Spain's ports. Its purpose was clear: to gain control of the English Channel, link up with Spanish forces in the Low Countries, and deliver an invasion army onto English soil. For Philip, it was more than strategy. It was a holy mission to depose Elizabeth, restore Catholicism, and reassert Spain's dominance. England faced the greatest peril of Elizabeth's reign. The kingdom's resources were limited, its population small compared to Spain's empire. Yet what England lacked in wealth and numbers, it compensated with determination, leadership, and naval innovation. The Tudor Navy, built under Henry VIII and strengthened by Elizabeth, was smaller but more agile. Its ships were faster, more maneuverable, and designed to fight with broadside cannon rather than rely on boarding. In the spring of 1588, Elizabeth and her council prepared. Coastal beacons were readied, militia mustered, and fleets positioned. Command of the Navy was entrusted to Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, with Sir Francis Drake as his vice admiral. Drake, already a national hero, embodied the blend of experience and daring England required. The Armada sailed from Spain in May, but storms forced it back. Only in late July did it approach the English Channel. The first encounters revealed the contrast between the two fleets. Spain's ships were large, built for carrying soldiers and for close combat. England's were lighter, designed to strike from distance. As the Armada advanced in crescent formation, the English harried it with long-range gunnery, darting in and out with speed. For days, the Channel became a stage for constant maneuver and cannon fire. The English could not destroy the Armada outright, but they disrupted its cohesion and forced it northward. At Plymouth, at Portland, at the Isle of Wight, the dance continued. Spanish ships struggled to close for boarding. English captains refused to be trapped. Ammunition ran low. Tempers strained. But the fleet endured. The decisive moment came at Calais. The Armada anchored to await word from the Duke of Parma, who commanded Spain's invasion army in the Low Countries. Yet English intelligence and quick thinking altered the balance. On the night of July 28th, the English sent fireships, old vessels set ablaze, into the anchored Armada. Panic erupted. Spanish ships cut their anchors and scattered to avoid the flames. Formation dissolved. The following morning, the English pressed their advantage at the Battle of Gravelines. Here, speed and firepower told. English gunners poured broadsides into the disordered Armada, tearing rigging, smashing hulls, and driving the fleet into retreat. Though few ships were sunk outright, the psychological impact was immense. The invincible fleet had been broken in open battle. The Armada's ordeal was not finished. Driven north by English pursuit and shifting winds, the Spaniards attempted to circle Scotland and Ireland to return home. Storms lashed the fleet, wrecking ships on rocky coasts. Those that survived limped back to Spain, battered and reduced. Of the 130 ships that had set out, barely two-thirds returned, many in poor condition. England rejoiced. Bonfires lit the night sky, sermons celebrated deliverance, and Elizabeth's own presence at Tilbury, where she addressed her troops, became immortalized in memory. She declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her words embodied the spirit of resistance, a small kingdom standing defiant against the mightiest empire of the age. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in history. Spain remained powerful, and the war would continue for years, but the illusion of invincibility was shattered. England had proven that it could withstand Europe's greatest force and even triumph. Naval power, not armies, had determined the outcome. The sea was no longer Spain's domain alone. For the English, the victory carried profound meaning. It confirmed the value of their naval innovations, of lighter, faster ships and disciplined gunnery. It demonstrated the importance of private initiative, for many of the captains had been forged in the world of trade and privateering. Most of all, it gave England a new sense of destiny. No longer merely a cautious island realm, it now saw itself as a power that could shape the seas. The Armada's failure also marked the gradual decline of Spain's maritime supremacy. Though Spain would continue to dominate vast territories, the strain of endless war, coupled with financial burdens, eroded its strength. Meanwhile, England's confidence surged. Merchants, sailors, and adventurers saw opportunities in the Atlantic, in the Americas, and in distant Asia. The dream of settlement, already attempted at Roanoke, would be pursued again with greater resolve. Elizabeth's reign would be remembered as a golden age, not only for poetry and drama, but for the shaping of a maritime nation. The Armada's defeat became its symbol, a triumph of ingenuity over power, of resilience over fear, of a kingdom discovering its future. The fire ships at Calais, the broadsides at Gravelines, and the Queen's words at Tilbury were not just moments of survival. They were the birth cries of an empire yet to come. From 1588 onward, England's course was set. The sea would be its shield, its weapon, and its destiny. Out of the fire of 1588 emerged a new breed of English seafarer, the Sea Dogs, whose daring voyages carried forward the momentum of victory. The rise of the Sea Dogs. In the aftermath of the Armada's defeat, England entered a new phase of maritime ambition. The great threat from Spain had been repelled, and though war continued, the victory emboldened Elizabeth's kingdom. Confidence grew, and with it came the flowering of a unique group of adventurers whose exploits would define the late Elizabethan seas, the so-called Sea Dogs. The term was both affectionate and fierce. These were not ordinary sailors, but hardened captains, men like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, whose lives at sea embodied a mix of courage, cunning, and calculated risk. They were privateers chartered by the crown, but also entrepreneurs who blended exploration, commerce, and predation into a single pursuit. Their actions reflected both the spirit of the age and the limitations of the realm. England lacked the vast resources of Spain, so it relied on daring individuals willing to strike boldly where state power alone could not reach. Each of the Sea Dogs had his own path, but together they formed a fraternity of sorts, bound by loyalty to crown and profit alike. Hawkins, the seasoned navigator, had begun voyages in the 1560s, pushing English trade into dangerous waters claimed by Spain. Though controversial, his ventures taught valuable lessons about Atlantic navigation and the weaknesses of Spanish defenses. His younger kinsman, Drake, surpassed even those exploits, becoming the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe and striking fear into Spain's Pacific strongholds. Frobisher, meanwhile, sought a northern passage to Asia, braving icy waters and stormy seas, his quests reflecting the relentless search for new routes and riches. These men were more than pirates, though their Spanish foes saw them as such. They operated with letters of marque, giving legal sanction to attack enemy shipping during wartime. Yet their activities were not limited to raiding treasure fleets. They mapped coasts, tested trade routes, and brought back intelligence of distant lands. In their wake, they carried home gold and silver, spices and furs, but also knowledge of winds, harbors, and opportunities that would one day sustain empire. The Sea Dogs thrived in a world where the boundaries between war and commerce were blurred. A single voyage might include raiding a Spanish port, trading with local tribes, and surveying new coastlines. Profit and patriotism intertwined. Elizabeth herself mastered the art of ambiguity, publicly disavowing the more aggressive attacks when diplomacy required, yet privately taking her share of the spoils. For the crown, the arrangement was ideal. England gained wealth and prestige without bearing the full cost of empire. The Armada's defeat only strengthened their reputation. It proved that Spain could be challenged, that naval daring could alter the balance of power. Drake's raids in the Caribbean, Hawkins' ventures in West Africa, and Frobisher's northern explorations all became part of a larger narrative. England was rising, not through sheer numbers or endless wealth, but through ingenuity and boldness upon the sea. Yet there was fragility in their enterprise. Voyages were perilous, fortunes uncertain, and the line between glory and ruin razor thin. Some expeditions returned laden with treasure, others ended in shipwreck or poverty. For every Drake who returned triumphant, there were captains who disappeared into the waves, their names forgotten. Still, the pattern endured. Risk accepted as the price of greatness, the sea as both opportunity and grave. To contemporaries, the Sea Dogs symbolized the character of Elizabethan England itself, restless, resilient, ambitious. They were celebrated in ballads, immortalized in chronicles, and envied by rivals. Their lives offered proof that even a modest island kingdom could challenge the richest empire on earth. But perhaps their greatest legacy lay not in plunder, but in imagination. They revealed the ocean as a field of possibilities for trade, for settlement, for expansion. They hinted that England's future was not confined to the Channel or the North Sea, but stretched across the Atlantic and beyond. In the exploits of the Sea Dogs, one could glimpse the early outlines of empire. By the close of Elizabeth's reign, the names of Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher had become inseparable from the story of England's rise. Their methods were controversial, their fortunes uneven, but together they marked the transition from an island kingdom of raiders to a nation preparing for colonization and commerce on a global scale. The Sea Dogs were not yet empire builders, but they were the harbingers, the restless pioneers whose sails foreshadowed the fleets of a future age. Yet the legacy of the Sea Dogs was not measured only in raids or treasure. It lay in the doors they opened to a new world of commerce, where England's future power would be forged not just by cannon, but by contracts. A new commercial economy. The seas that Elizabeth's captains had mastered did more than carry ships of war and treasure. They carried ideas, goods, and the beginnings of a new economy. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, England was no longer defined by its medieval order of feudal ties and agricultural dues. A transformation was underway, slow, uneven, but unmistakable. Commerce was rising, and with it came a new vision of wealth, power, and national purpose. The old feudal world had bound wealth to land. Lords measured their status by estates, rents, and harvests, while peasants lived within the confines of manorial life. But as exploration expanded horizons, markets grew, and trade crossed oceans, wealth began to take on a new meaning. Merchants, not lords, now found themselves at the center of economic change. Profit flowed less from fields and more from ships, warehouses, and trading ventures. The sea became the true frontier of English prosperity. This shift gave birth to a new doctrine, mercantilism. At its heart was a simple conviction that the strength of a nation lay in its control of trade and its accumulation of precious metals. Gold and silver were seen as the lifeblood of power. To secure them, a kingdom had to export more than it imported, dominate markets abroad, and defend its commerce with armed force if necessary. For England, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. Spain's empire, enriched by the mines of the Americas, seemed unassailable, and Portugal's network stretched deep into Asia. Yet mercantilist thinking encouraged England to believe it could compete. If trade was the source of wealth, then even a small island kingdom could rise by harnessing its ships, merchants, and seamen. Colonies, markets, and resources were no longer distant curiosities. They became essential pieces of a national strategy. The chartered trading company became the instrument of this new vision. In 1600, Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the East India Company, giving merchants the right to trade with the vast markets of Asia. It was a bold experiment, private capital pooled by investors, sanctioned by the crown, and directed toward profit on a global scale. Similar ventures followed, such as the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company, each expanding England's reach into new regions. The merchant, once a figure of modest station, was now reshaping the fortunes of the realm. The rise of trade altered English society itself. Towns like London, Bristol, and Exeter grew as centers of commerce. Docks teemed with ships, markets buzzed with goods, and wealth began to concentrate in the hands of those who dealt not in acres, but in contracts. A new class emerged, straddling the worlds of gentry and merchant, eager to invest in ventures that promised not only profit, but also national glory. Mercantilism also reshaped the crown's perspective. Kings and queens came to see commerce not as a private affair, but as a matter of state security. Trade routes had to be protected, monopolies enforced, and rival powers resisted. The line between economic competition and military conflict blurred, for in mercantilist thinking, every gain by one nation was a loss to another. The marketplace was a battlefield of its own, and the navy became its shield. This new commercial economy did not erase the old structures of land and feudal obligation, but it transformed them. Landowners invested in trade, merchants bought estates, and wealth circulated in new ways. The logic of medieval hierarchy gave way, slowly but surely, to the dynamism of markets. In the span of a few generations, England began to imagine itself not as a feudal kingdom bound to its soil, but as a mercantile power reaching outward. Thus, the age of exploration, begun with daring voyages and privateering raids, laid foundations far deeper than treasure and triumph. It gave birth to an economy oriented toward the seas, an ideology that linked national strength to commerce, and a generation of merchants and investors who would fuel England's imperial rise. The world of knights and castles was yielding to the world of contracts and companies, and in that transition, England discovered not just a new economy, but a new identity. And it was within this new vision of wealth and power that England's first great experiment in corporate enterprise emerged, the Muscovy Company, a venture that sought opportunity not in the riches of the tropics, but in the frozen seas of the north. The Muscovy Company, 1555. The first great experiment in England's age of chartered companies was not in Asia, nor in the New World, but in the icy waters of the north. In 1555, long before the East India Company set sail for the spice ports of the East, English merchants looked toward Russia and the Arctic in search of opportunity. Out of their ambitions was born the Muscovy Company, a venture that would link England to Northern Europe, open new markets, and kindle dreams of reaching Asia by a northern route. The mid-16th century was a time of fierce competition for trade. Spain and Portugal dominated the seas to the south, their galleons returning heavy with silver and spices. England, smaller and late to the game, sought an opening where rivals were weakest. The merchants of London, led by visionary investors like Sebastian Cabot, reasoned that if a direct passage to Asia could not be found by rounding Africa or crossing the Atlantic, perhaps it might be discovered through the Arctic seas, a northeast passage across the top of the world. An expedition was launched in 1553 under Sir Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor. Willoughby and his men perished in the frozen wilderness, but Chancellor pressed on, sailing into the White Sea and reaching the court of Ivan IV of Russia, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. There, in Moscow, he negotiated the beginnings of a trade agreement between England and Russia. From this bold gamble, the Muscovy Company was established 2 years later, securing a monopoly over trade with Russia and Northern Europe. The company's charter marked a turning point. It gave English merchants exclusive rights to trade in Russian markets, importing furs, timber, hemp, and other northern goods, while exporting English cloth and manufactured wares. For the first time, English merchants were organized as a corporate body, pooling capital, sharing risk, and operating under royal sanction. It was an arrangement that reflected the new mercantilist spirit, private enterprise guided by national purpose. The Muscovy Company did more than bring wealth. It expanded England's horizons. Through Russia, English goods reached markets deeper into Asia. The overland caravans that carried silks, spices, and precious wares from Persia and Central Asia now intersected with English merchants, creating new channels of exchange. Though the dream of a northern sea route to China and India remained elusive, the company provided a crucial link between England and the wider world of Eurasian commerce. Relations with Russia were not always easy. Ivan IV welcomed English merchants at first, seeing them as useful allies and sources of Western goods. But the volatile Tsar's moods and the turbulence of Russian politics made trade unpredictable. Still, the company endured, maintaining its position as England's first great overseas trading enterprise. Its existence proved that English merchants could compete in distant markets, organize collectively, and sustain ventures over decades rather than years. The Muscovy Company also introduced England to the practical realities of long-distance trade. It required skilled navigators, reliable ships, and knowledge of foreign courts. Diplomacy became as vital as seamanship, and the company often acted as England's informal ambassador in Moscow. The intertwining of commerce and politics, so characteristic of later empires, was already visible here. Though its profits never matched the spectacular wealth of Iberian treasure fleets, the Muscovy Company was a milestone. It represented a new model of enterprise, risk shared by many, reward flowing not only to individuals but to the kingdom. It was the ancestor of the companies that would later dominate the oceans, from the East India Company in Asia to the Virginia Company in America. The frozen seas of the north did not yield the shortcut to Asia that dreamers imagined. Yet the Muscovy Company achieved something perhaps greater. It proved that England could carve its own path into the global economy, even in the shadow of Spanish and Portuguese supremacy. From the ice and snow of the Arctic, a new commercial confidence was born. If the Muscovy Company had been a bold experiment that proved England could organize commerce beyond its shores, then the East India Company was the great leap forward, a charter that transformed tentative trade into a vehicle of empire, carrying English ambition from the frozen north to the fabled riches of Asia. The East India Company, 1600. At the dawn of the 17th century, a new kind of institution emerged that would change England's destiny forever. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of merchants, giving birth to the East India Company. It was a momentous act, for this was not merely a trading association, it was a vehicle of empire, cloaked in the language of commerce but carrying the weight of national ambition. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Individual merchants lacked the resources to compete with Spain and Portugal, whose fleets dominated the trade of spices and silks. By pooling capital, sharing risks, and securing monopoly rights from the crown, English merchants could stand together as a corporate power. The charter gave them exclusive rights to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, an enormous claim that stretched across Asia's richest markets. From the beginning, the East India Company embodied the dual nature of England's expansion, private initiative fused with state authority. Though its shareholders were private men of business, the company bore the sanction of the monarch. It could negotiate treaties, mint coins, and maintain armed ships. In essence, it was a state within a state, an enterprise driven by profit, yet wielding powers usually reserved for governments. The company's first voyages were tentative. In 1601, a fleet under Sir James Lancaster sailed to the East Indies, bringing back cargoes of pepper and spices that yielded immense profit. Other expeditions followed, establishing trading posts along the Indian coast and in Southeast Asia. Slowly, the company carved out a presence in a world already crowded by Portuguese and Dutch rivals. Its ships brought home pepper, cloves, nutmeg, silks, and cottons, luxuries that transformed English markets and whetted appetites for more. But the company was more than a merchant venture. It became an arm of diplomacy and increasingly of power. In Asia, trade could not exist without treaties, alliances, and occasionally force. Company factors negotiated with local rulers, built fortified warehouses, and sometimes clashed with European competitors. Each voyage returned not only with profit, but with knowledge, maps, languages, and strategies that deepened England's reach into the East. At home, the company reshaped society. The wealth it generated enriched merchants, investors, and the crown alike. Its shares created new opportunities for investment, allowing the emerging middle classes to tie their fortunes to overseas trade. In time, the East India Company became a symbol of England's mercantile vision that national power and private profit were not in conflict, but intertwined. The company's influence was not limited to economics. It shaped the imagination of a generation, Tales of the East. Its spices, textiles, and wonders entered English literature, theater, and art. Asia, once distant and mysterious, became a land of opportunity in the English mind, a horizon to be conquered by commerce as much as by arms. The East India Company did not yet rule territories, nor had it become the vast empire builder of later centuries, but the foundations were laid. It demonstrated that private merchants, armed with royal authority, could act as instruments of national expansion. It blurred the line between state and market, between commerce and conquest. In 1600, the company was one venture among many, fragile and uncertain. Yet in its charter lay the seeds of a transformation. For centuries to come, the East India Company would serve as the spearhead of England's advance into Asia, shaping not only the destiny of the subcontinent, but the very identity of Britain itself. The creation of the company marked a turning point in world history. No longer was England merely a latecomer to the trade routes of Europe. With the East India Company, it had found its instrument, an engine of wealth and power, built upon the union of merchant ambition and royal authority. If the East India Company pointed England eastward toward the riches of Asia, the Virginia Company turned its gaze westward across the Atlantic. For even as merchants sought spices and silks, another dream was taking shape, the vision of planting English roots in the New World. North America and the birth of Jamestown. While the East India Company turned England's gaze eastward, another enterprise directed its hopes across the Atlantic. The dream of a New World colony, long frustrated by the failures at Roanoke, found new life in the early 17th century. Out of that vision came Jamestown, founded in 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Though fragile in its beginnings, it became the seed from which England's American empire would grow. The Virginia Company, chartered by King James I in 1606, was the instrument of this bold undertaking. Like the Muscovy and East India Companies before it, the Virginia Company represented a fusion of private capital and royal authority. Investors in London and elsewhere pooled their resources, hoping to profit from trade, land, and resources. In return, they carried the English flag into the vast unknown of America. The voyage across the Atlantic was perilous. 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, bore a small band of settlers to the coast of Virginia. In May 1607, they established a fortified settlement on a swampy peninsula along the James River. They named it Jamestown in honor of their king. It was the first successful step toward what earlier attempts at Roanoke had failed to achieve, a permanent foothold for England in the New World. Survival, however, was uncertain. The early years at Jamestown were marked by hunger, disease, and fragile relations with native peoples. Many of the settlers were gentlemen unused to hard labor. Others lacked the skills needed to farm or build in a harsh environment. Supplies from England were infrequent, and at times the colony teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet through determination, adaptation, and the leadership of figures like Captain John Smith, the settlement endured. What ultimately saved Jamestown was not gold or silver, but a plant. By 1612, the introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe transformed the colony's fortunes. Tobacco proved well suited to Virginia's soil, and European demand for the leaf was insatiable. Soon, fields of tobacco stretched around Jamestown, and the colony's survival was secured through export. Tobacco became the lifeblood of Virginia, a cash crop that bound the colony to the rhythms of Atlantic trade. The impact of this new commodity was immense. Investors in England saw profits, while settlers found a reason to persevere. Ships carried tobacco across the ocean, returning with supplies, tools, and more colonists. What had begun as a precarious outpost grew into a settlement that attracted families, craftsmen, and farmers. Jamestown became not just a trading post, but a community, a transplanted fragment of England on American soil. The success of tobacco also carried deeper consequences. It tied the colony to the global economy, linking Virginia's fields with the markets of London, Amsterdam, and beyond. It demanded labor, first from struggling settlers, later from indentured servants, and eventually from enslaved Africans. Thus, from its earliest days, Jamestown reflected both the promise and the contradictions of England's colonial enterprise. Still, the significance of Jamestown lay not only in tobacco or trade, but in its permanence. For the first time, England had established a settlement that would endure. Unlike Roanoke, Jamestown survived its hardships and laid the foundation for expansion along the Atlantic seaboard. Other colonies would follow: Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, each building upon the precedent Jamestown had set. Jamestown's story symbolized the larger transformation of England itself. It was no longer merely a kingdom of raiders, privateers, and merchants, but a nation planting roots overseas. Colonization had moved beyond raids and ventures. It had become settlement, with farms, homes, and generations to come. From a marshy peninsula on the James River, the English presence in America began. What started as a fragile experiment grew into the first chapter of an empire that would one day stretch across continents. Jamestown was the proof. England's future was not confined to its island shores, but scattered across oceans, fields, and distant frontiers. Yet Jamestown's survival was not an isolated triumph. Its tobacco fields and those of the colonies that followed soon became threads in a far larger web of exchange, an Atlantic system of ships, goods, and labor that would come to be known as the Triangular Trade. The Triangular Trade. As Jamestown took root and tobacco fields spread along the James River, the English colonies entered into a larger web of exchange. No colony could survive in isolation. Their prosperity depended on ships that crossed the Atlantic, carrying goods, people, and ideas. Out of this growing system emerged what would later be called the triangular trade, a vast network that bound together Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and in doing so, reshaped the destiny of England's empire. At its simplest, the trade was a cycle. English ships departed from ports like London, Bristol, and Liverpool, laden with textiles, metal goods, and manufactured wares. These were exchanged along the coast of Africa for commodities and human labor, transported across the Atlantic to the plantations of the New World. From there, colonial products, tobacco, sugar, cotton, and later rum, returned to Europe, feeding markets and filling treasuries. The triangle turned endlessly, a circuit of wealth and exploitation that tied three continents into a single economic rhythm. For the colonies of North America, this system was both lifeline and cage. Tobacco from Virginia, rice from the Carolinas, and later cotton from the South flowed outward, carried by English ships to Europe. In return came tools, clothing, and goods that sustained settlers' lives. The cycle gave colonies access to markets far larger than they could reach alone, securing their survival and enriching their investors. For England, the triangular trade was nothing less than transformative. It was mercantilism in action, exports flowing outward, imports controlled, and bullion flowing inward. The wealth of the Atlantic fed English cities, financed new ventures, and supported the crown. London's docks grew into the heart of a global marketplace, while smaller ports thrived as arteries of imperial commerce. Yet the system's foundations were deeply unequal. Labor was the key to its profits, and as demand for tobacco and sugar grew, colonies sought more and more workers. Indentured servants from Europe filled some of the need, but the largest share was met through the forced transport of Africans. This dark reality gave the trade its harshest dimension, the Middle Passage, where countless lives were uprooted and sent across the ocean. Still, from the perspective of England's rise, the triangular trade built the structure of empire. Ships multiplied, shipyards expanded, and navigation became a science of profit as much as survival. Merchants, insurers, and bankers in London developed new instruments of credit and investment to support the vast exchange. Colonial ports like Boston and Charleston, though small by European standards, grew into bustling nodes of transatlantic commerce. The triangular trade also carried cultural consequences. Goods were not the only things exchanged across the seas. Ideas, languages, and practices moved with them, creating a world increasingly connected by ships and markets. English tastes were altered by colonial produce, tea sweetened with Caribbean sugar, pipes filled with Virginia tobacco, fabrics dyed with exotic colors. The domestic life of England became interwoven with the labor of distant fields. By the mid-17th century, this system was firmly established. It created wealth, but also dependency. Colonies could thrive only by feeding the triangular roots, and England's power was tied to its ability to control and protect them. Naval strength became indispensable, for the sea lanes were lifeblood itself. Thus, the triangular trade was more than commerce. It was the framework of England's first empire, an invisible architecture of routes, goods, and ships. It turned plantations into engines of export, ports into gates of exchange, and England into a nation whose prosperity rested on the ocean. From this triangle of trade, the future lines of empire were drawn. Yet this vast web of commerce could not have thrived on ambition alone. To sustain the triangular trade, to protect colonies and challenge rivals, England required not only daring sailors, but the very tools of mastery at sea. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation that turned fragile ventures into enduring empire. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation. The triumphs of England's sailors were not born of courage alone. They rested on a revolution in the tools of the sea, ships, instruments, and knowledge that transformed exploration into empire. By the 16th and 17th centuries, advances in shipbuilding and navigation gave England the means to project power far beyond its shores, laying the foundations of a maritime nation. At the heart of this change were the ships themselves. The early caravels, pioneered by the Portuguese, had already shown how deep keels and lateen sails could harness wind from multiple directions, making long voyages possible. Building upon this design, the great galleons of Spain and later England emerged as the war horses of the ocean. With towering sterns, multiple decks, and rows of heavy guns, the galleon combined the endurance of the merchantmen with the firepower of the fortress. English captains like Drake and Hawkins mastered these vessels, using their speed and maneuverability to strike at lumbering treasure fleets and to defend their own coasts. But England's genius was not only in adopting foreign models, it was in adapting them. In the dockyards of Deptford and Chatham, under the patronage of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, new methods of construction were refined. English shipwrights built vessels that were lighter, faster, and better suited to the rough waters of the North Atlantic. The broadside gun platform perfected on these ships gave English fleets an edge. They could deliver sustained fire without needing to grapple and board. This innovation marked a turning point, transforming naval warfare from hand-to-hand combat into battles of artillery and maneuver. Navigation, too, advanced. The mariner's compass, long used in the Mediterranean, became indispensable to oceanic travel. Astrolabes and later cross-staffs allowed sailors to measure latitude by the stars. Charts grew more accurate as each voyage added to the store of knowledge. Maps, once patchworks of myth and guesswork, became instruments of strategy, guiding fleets across oceans with increasing precision. The age of guesswork was giving way to the age of calculation. The integration of these advances created a new kind of seafarer. The English sailor of the 17th century was not merely a fighter or adventurer. He was part of a system that fused shipbuilding, science, and state power. Dockyards became the engines of empire, where carpenters, smiths, and riggers built the tools of global reach. Libraries of charts, tables, and sailing directions were as crucial as cannons and sails. This technological foundation explained much of England's resilience. Against Spain's mighty Armada, it was not numbers alone, but ship design and seamanship that had carried the day. In the decades that followed, as trade expanded and colonies grew, these advances allowed England to sustain the triangular trade, defend its sea lanes, and challenge rivals in waters from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. In the rise of the galleon, the refinement of the dockyard, and the spread of compass and chart, one sees the scaffolding of empire. For it was through mastery of ships and navigation that England turned from a kingdom on the edge of Europe into a nation whose horizon spanned the globe. Yet this vast web of commerce could not have thrived on ambition alone. To sustain the triangular trade, to protect colonies, and challenge rivals, England required not only daring sailors but the very tools of mastery at sea. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation that turned fragile ventures into enduring empire. Knowledge and the humanist tradition. The mastery of the sea was not built upon ships alone. It was also constructed in words, charts, and ideas. The age of exploration was as much an intellectual movement as it was a maritime one, for the discoveries of sailors had to be recorded, interpreted, and shared. In England, the rise of print and humanist learning gave explorers a voice and gave the nation a memory of its triumphs and trials upon the ocean. Books and maps became instruments of power. The printing press allowed accounts of voyages to spread beyond the sailors themselves, reaching merchants, investors, and ordinary readers. Each tale of storm and survival, each description of distant peoples and lands added to a growing library of exploration. Knowledge, once scattered in private journals, now entered the bloodstream of national culture. Among those who shaped this culture was Richard Hakluyt, clergyman, scholar, and tireless advocate for England's maritime destiny. His great work, Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation, published in 1589 and expanded in 1598 to 1599, gathered together the stories of English seafarers into a monumental chronicle. It was not simply a collection of travelogues, it was a manifesto. Hakluyt argued that England's future lay across the seas, in trade, colonies, and exploration. Through the voices of sailors and merchants, he presented the ocean as England's stage. Hakluyt's work gave meaning to scattered exploits. The raids of Drake, the ventures of Frobisher, the hardships of Raleigh's colonists, all were woven into a single tapestry, one that showed England as a nation destined for maritime greatness. For readers at home, the book turned distant voyages into shared experience. It allowed the merchant in London or the student in Oxford to imagine themselves part of a national project that spanned the globe. Maps, too, carried a similar power. Each new voyage corrected the errors of the old, filling blank spaces with coastlines, rivers, and names. Cartographers in England drew upon reports brought back by captains, turning their observations into instruments of navigation and imagination alike. A map was both a guide for ships and a vision of empire, for every line sketched upon parchment was a claim upon the future. The spread of knowledge reinforced the humanist ideals of the Renaissance. Exploration was not only a quest for riches, but also for understanding. Accounts of new plants, animals, and cultures entered natural philosophy and broadened the horizons of European science. The ocean connected not only markets, but also minds, knitting together a global exchange of knowledge. In this way, the intellectual world of books and maps sustained the practical world of ships and trade. The dockyards of Deptford built the vessels. The pages of Hakluyt gave them purpose. Navigation required both compasses and chronicles, both the discipline of science and the inspiration of story. Through words as well as sails, England's path was charted. The legacy of exploration lived not only in ports and battlefields, but in libraries, atlases, and imaginations. And from that marriage of knowledge and power emerged a vision of England as a nation not bound by its shores, but defined by the oceans it had begun to master. Yet the influence of the sea did not end with maps and chronicles. What explorers recorded and scholars preserved soon flowed into the imagination of a nation. From the stage of Shakespeare to the songs of sailors, the ocean was no longer only charted on parchment. It was celebrated in culture, shaping how England saw itself and its destiny upon the waves. Cultural influence. A nation of the sea. The rise of England's maritime world was not only measured in ships and charts. It found expression in culture, in words and imagination, shaping how a people understood themselves. The sea, once a boundary that defined England's isolation, became a symbol of its strength. Literature, theater, and national identity absorbed the rhythms of ocean life, and through them England came to see itself as a nation whose destiny was tied to the waves. Nowhere was this spirit more vividly captured than in the works of William Shakespeare. Writing in the age of Elizabeth, Shakespeare's plays often echoed the themes of voyage, discovery, and the uncertainties of the sea. In The Tempest, the storm and the island became metaphors for power, knowledge, and human ambition. In Othello, the Mediterranean world framed the drama of empire and encounter. Even in his histories, the language of tides and ships carried deeper meaning, reflecting a culture increasingly conscious of its maritime identity. The sea in Shakespeare was not merely a backdrop, it was a force of fate, echoing the risks and rewards of England's ventures beyond its shores. This cultural shift was not confined to literature. Ballads and popular tales celebrated the exploits of sailors, while chronicles immortalized the deeds of Drake, Hawkins, and Raleigh. The victories at sea, especially the defeat of the Armada, were retold in sermons, poems, and pamphlets, reinforcing the idea that God's providence favored England's ships. To live on the island was to live with the ocean, and by the early 17th century, that relationship was recast from vulnerability into pride. The image of England as a nation of the sea grew steadily stronger. It was a phrase both practical and symbolic. Practically, England's survival and prosperity depended on maritime trade, on fish from northern waters, and on the tobacco, sugar, and spices that arrived in its ports. Symbolically, the sea became the mirror of national character, restless, resilient, and unbounded. The channel that once seemed a moat of defense was now celebrated as the highway of opportunity. This identity carried political weight. Monarchs and ministers invoked the sea in their rhetoric, urging investment in ships and colonies as duties of the realm. Poets and chroniclers wrapped maritime expansion in the language of destiny, portraying England as chosen to carry commerce, culture, and faith across the waves. A sense of exceptionalism took root, woven not only from battles and profits, but from the shared imagination of a people who believed the ocean was theirs to master. Thus, the cultural influence of the sea deepened the practical realities of empire. Shipyards and trading companies provided the means, but Shakespeare's words and the songs of sailors gave them meaning. The English no longer thought of themselves as merely an island kingdom at Europe's edge. They saw themselves as something greater, a people whose history and future would be written upon the waters of the world. This vision of England as a nation of the sea was not confined to the stage or the printed page. It spilled into policy, diplomacy, and power. What poets imagined and sailors sang soon became the language of statesmen, for in the 17th century, the sea was no longer merely a metaphor of destiny. It was the arena where rival empires clashed and where England would test the strength of its new identity, politics and diplomacy in a maritime age. By the early 17th century, England stood at a crossroads of ambition and rivalry. The defeat of the Armada had marked the island kingdom as a power to be reckoned with, yet its path to maritime greatness was far from secure. Spain still commanded vast resources from the Americas, and Portugal remained entrenched in Asia. But England, with its growing fleet and expanding colonies, had stepped irreversibly into the contest for empire. The seas were no longer a Spanish monopoly. They were a battlefield of politics, diplomacy, and strategy, where England would begin to define its place among the powers of Europe. Relations with Spain remained fraught. Though open war waned after Elizabeth's death, mistrust endured. Spanish treasure fleets continued to sail from the Caribbean, and English captains eyed them with restless ambition. Skirmishes persisted on distant waters, and the rivalry, though less dramatic than in 1588, never truly disappeared. Spain was still the greatest Catholic monarchy, while England, now firmly Protestant, saw itself as a counterweight in the balance of European faith and power. Yet it was not only Spain that shaped England's destiny. A new rival emerged, the Dutch Republic. Born from rebellion against Spanish rule, the Dutch rose swiftly as masters of commerce and shipping. Their fleets dominated trade routes from the Baltic to the East Indies, and their merchants filled European markets with spices, silks, and grain. To many in England, the Dutch were both allies and competitors, partners in Protestant faith and opposition to Spain, yet rivals whose success threatened England's own ambitions. Diplomacy reflected this ambiguity. At times, England and the Dutch cooperated against Spain. At others, their competition boiled into open hostility. The contest for control of trade in Asia and the Atlantic grew sharper, foreshadowing the series of Anglo-Dutch wars that would dominate the mid-17th century. France, too, loomed as a rival in waiting. Though weakened by its wars of religion, France remained a kingdom of immense potential. Its long coastline, fertile lands, and growing navy meant that once stabilized, it could challenge England at sea. By the reign of James I and Charles I, French ambitions in North America and the Caribbean were becoming evident, planting the seeds of future rivalry that would span continents. England thus entered the 17th century surrounded by opportunity and danger. Diplomats maneuvered in European courts, while merchants and adventurers tested their fortunes overseas. Alliances shifted, rivalries deepened, and the English crown sought to balance faith, profit, and power in a world where the ocean was the ultimate arbiter. The political stage of Europe was no longer confined to its borders. Colonies, fleets, and trading companies became tools of diplomacy, as important as treaties or armies. To command the seas was to command influence, and England, though still smaller than its rivals, had begun to understand that its survival and greatness depended on this truth. In the decades to come, England's diplomacy would be shaped not only by continental concerns, but by the tides of empire. The nation that once looked inward would now measure itself against Spain, the Dutch, and France, not as a mere island kingdom, but as an emerging maritime power whose fortunes rose and fell with the waves. Yet diplomacy and rivalry were only part of the story. Beneath the clash of fleets and the maneuvers of courts lay the quieter, but no less decisive, rise of commerce. The same seas that carried envoys and warships also bore cargoes of sugar, tobacco, and timber, enriching a new class of merchants and transforming England's ports into gateways of empire. Politics had set the stage, but it was trade that filled it with life. Economic transformations, merchants and ports. The 17th century was not only a time of shifting alliances and rivalries, it was also a period of profound economic transformation. England's ventures upon the seas, born of competition with Spain, Holland, and France, yielded more than victories. They reshaped the very fabric of society. Out of maritime enterprise came wealth, and out of wealth arose a new class of men whose fortunes were tied not to land, but to trade. The merchant emerged as one of the defining figures of the age. In medieval times, power had belonged to nobles whose estates measured their worth. By the 17th century, however, wealth was increasingly calculated in cargoes, ships, and contracts. Merchants who once stood below the gentry now grew rich from tobacco, sugar, timber, and spices. Some purchased estates and sought the respectability of the landed elite, while others reinvested their profits into fleets and trading companies, fueling further expansion. Their influence reached into politics as well as commerce, for parliaments and councils could no longer ignore men whose ships brought gold into the treasury and sustenance into the kingdom. The prosperity of these merchants was mirrored in the rise of England's ports. London, already the heart of the kingdom, expanded into a global entrepot. Its docks along the Thames bustled with ships arriving from Virginia, the Caribbean, Africa, and the East Indies. Warehouses filled with tobacco bales, sugar casks, and silks transformed the city into a marketplace of the world. Banks, insurers, and brokers gathered near the river, creating institutions that would form the backbone of modern finance. Yet London was not alone. Bristol, with its western harbor, became a key link in the Atlantic system. From its quays, ships sailed to Africa and the Americas, tying the city's fortunes to the triangular trade. Bristol's merchants grew wealthy as middlemen of empire, and its streets, once provincial, echoed with the commerce of distant continents. Further south, Plymouth retained its reputation as a port of adventure, launching expeditions and serving as a naval base. Each of these cities, though distinct, became engines of the maritime economy, their prosperity inseparable from England's expansion abroad. The growth of trade also altered the rhythms of daily life. Imported goods, once rare luxuries, became woven into English households. Sugar-sweetened tea, tobacco-filled pipes, and textiles carried dyes from foreign lands. Markets widened, tastes changed, and the material culture of England bore the imprint of empire. The merchant's success was not confined to ledgers. It was visible in the habits of an entire people. But with opportunity came dependence. The economy of London, Bristol, and Plymouth was now tied to distant colonies and fragile trade routes. Prosperity could vanish with a storm, a war, or a rival's embargo. This reality bound England ever closer to its navy, for only with command of the sea could the lifeblood of commerce be secured. By the mid-17th century, England was no longer simply an island kingdom of farmers and nobles. It had become a maritime nation, its wealth flowing through docks and counting houses as much as through fields and manors. The rise of the merchant and the port city was both cause and consequence of empire, and in their ascent lay the economic foundation of England's transformation into a global power. Yet the impact of this maritime economy reached far beyond docks and counting houses. The flow of ships and goods did not merely enrich merchants, it altered the lives of ordinary people, reshaping labor, consumption, and even faith itself. The same tide that filled warehouses in London and Bristol also carried with it the seeds of social transformation, pulling England's villages and towns into the restless orbit of empire. Social change in a maritime nation. The expansion of trade and empire did more than enrich merchants and fill the docks of England's ports. It reshaped the very structure of English society. The 17th century was an age when the rhythms of daily life, the opportunities of labor, and even the hopes of faith were altered by the tides of commerce and colonization. The first great transformation came in the world of work. For centuries, England had been a land of fields and manors, where labor meant farming under the rule of local lords. But as Atlantic trade grew, so too did new occupations. Sailors, shipwrights, dockhands, and warehouse keepers became as vital to the economy as plowmen and shepherds. The growth of manufacturing, spurred by demand for textiles and metal goods to exchange abroad, drew more workers into towns. Labor was no longer tied only to the soil. It was bound to the ships that carried England's fortunes across the seas. This expansion of trade also changed what people consumed. Imported goods, once reserved for elites, began to filter into ordinary households. Sugar sweetened the tea of commoners. Tobacco smoke drifted from village inns, and colonial textiles entered the wardrobes of artisans and tradesmen. The daily life of the English people reflected the reach of empire, and the appetite for such goods encouraged further ventures abroad. A society that once lived within the limits of local markets now looked outward, its tastes shaped by distant plantations and foreign exchanges. The empire also offered an escape, or at least the promise of one. Migration to the New World grew steadily throughout the 17th century. For some, it was economic. Landless laborers and ambitious younger sons saw opportunity in Virginia, New England, or the Caribbean. For others, it was spiritual. Religious divisions at home, sharpened by the Reformation and the conflicts between Crown and Parliament, spilled across the Atlantic. Puritans, dissenters, and other sects sought in America the freedom to shape their communities without interference. The colonies became not only outposts of trade, but experiments in faith and society. These migrations carried consequences for England itself. Whole communities sent members abroad, altering demographics and linking village life to colonial prospects. Families wrote letters across the sea, remittances traveled home, and the sense of England expanded to include settlements thousands of miles away. At the same time, tensions between religious groups at home were intensified by the colonies, as rival visions of faith and governance took root overseas and echoed back into English politics. The social fabric of the nation thus stretched and strained. Labor shifted, consumption expanded, and migration redefined what it meant to be English. Faith divided communities, yet also propelled them toward new beginnings across the ocean. The sea, once a boundary, had become a channel through which people, goods, and beliefs flowed freely, altering the foundations of society. By the mid-17th century, England was no longer a society bound solely to its parishes and fields. It was a nation in motion, carried by commerce, transformed by colonies, and reshaped by the restless currents of religion and migration. The ocean had entered the heart of English life, not as a distant horizon, but as the stage upon which its social order was continually remade. Yet these transformations at home were only half the story. The same forces that reshaped English work, faith, and daily life also projected outward, binding England to distant continents. Migration carried families across the Atlantic. Trade linked villages to plantations and markets thousands of miles away, and the rhythms of empire began to shape not just England's society, but the wider world. From these domestic changes flowed global consequences, for England's destiny was no longer insular, it was imperial. Global consequences, the first steps of empire. The 17th century was not only a turning point for England itself, it was a turning point for the world. The voyages of merchants, settlers, and sailors carried the island kingdom into the lives of distant continents, forging connections that would reshape global history. What began as fragile outposts of trade and settlement grew into the outlines of a system that posterity would call the British Empire. In the Americas, England's presence multiplied. From the first foothold at Jamestown, colonies spread along the Atlantic seaboard. Virginia's tobacco, the sugar of the Caribbean, and later the fisheries of New England became staples of transatlantic commerce. Plantations reshaped landscapes and tied the colonies to European markets, while migration carried English communities across the ocean. The Americas became both a source of wealth and a canvas for England's experiments in society and faith. They marked the beginning of a transatlantic identity where Englishness was no longer confined to the island but extended into new worlds. On the coasts of Africa, England's impact was felt through the expansion of trade. Forts and trading stations sprang up, linking African markets to the triangular system that bound three continents together. England did not yet command vast territories, but its ships were present, carrying goods in one direction and colonial products in the other. Africa's role in the system underscored the global reach of England's commerce. Its ships now touched every shore of the Atlantic. In Asia, the East India Company carved out its beginnings. Though still overshadowed by Portuguese and Dutch rivals, the company secured trading posts along the Indian coast and reached into Southeast Asia. Cotton, spices, and silks flowed westward, enriching merchants and transforming English tastes. Each warehouse, factory, and treaty deepened the kingdom's stake in the East. Though fragile and contested, these ventures marked the first threads of an imperial tapestry that would grow into Britain's most enduring global presence. These scattered ventures shared a common theme. They extended England's influence without yet demanding a formal empire. The crown did not govern continents directly, but trading companies, settlers, and merchants carried its flag to foreign shores. In this way, England's expansion was both private and public, driven by profit but underpinned by the authority of the state. It was an empire in embryo, imperfect, contested, and uneven, yet unmistakably taking form. The consequences were immense. England's horizons were no longer bounded by Europe. Its diplomacy, its economy, even its culture became entangled with distant regions. Goods from the Americas sweetened tea in English homes. Textiles from India colored London's markets, and alliances in Africa and Asia shaped the calculations of ministers in Whitehall. For the first time, the fate of England was linked not only to its neighbors across the Channel, but to lands across oceans. Thus, the 17th century stands as the beginning of a transformation. England as a global power. Its reach was not yet secure, nor its dominance complete. But from the plantations of Virginia to the factories of India, from the docks of London to the ports of Africa, the outline of empire was drawn. The island kingdom had become part of a larger story, the story of a world reshaped by sales, trade, and the restless ambition of a nation discovering its global destiny. These first steps of empire did more than redraw maps or enrich merchants. They reshaped how the English thought of themselves. The scattered colonies, the trading posts in Asia, and the triangular routes of the Atlantic were not only ventures abroad, they became part of the nation's identity at home. Out of this expansion grew a memory of triumphs, a mythology of sailors and explorers, and a sense that England's destiny was inseparable from the sea. It was from these beginnings that the legacy of the 17th century emerged, carrying forward not only institutions of empire, but also the stories and symbols that would define a nation's future. Conclusion and legacy. The 17th century closed upon a world transformed. What had begun as tentative voyages across uncertain seas had become the foundation of a maritime empire. England, once a kingdom confined to its island shores, had stepped onto the global stage. The age of exploration, with all its risks and uncertainties, had given way to something more enduring, the age of empire. In the early years, English ventures were fragile experiments, privateering raids against Spanish fleets, precarious colonies clinging to survival in Virginia, merchant ships competing for spices in Asian ports. But by the mid-17th century, these scattered undertakings had coalesced into something larger. Exploration no longer meant simply charting new coasts. It meant claiming land, planting crops, and building settlements. The colonies of America, the factories of India, and the forts of Africa formed a network that was at once commercial and territorial. This transition marked a profound change in England's vision of itself. Where once the nation measured success by daring exploits or singular voyages, it now measured power in sustained presence. Plantations, warehouses, and trading posts signaled permanence. Migration carried communities across the Atlantic, and trading companies bound distant markets to London's counting houses. Exploration had become colonization, ventures had become dominion. It was in this century that the foundations were laid for what later generations would call the empire on which the sun never sets. Though the phrase belonged to a later age, its roots lay here, in the restless energy of merchants and sailors, in the dreams of monarchs and ministers, and in the ships that carried England's fortunes across the globe. The legacy of this era lived not only in institutions, but in memory. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and the men who faced the Spanish Armada became part of a national mythology. Their deeds, preserved in chronicles, plays, and ballads, were celebrated as symbols of courage, ingenuity, and divine favor. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, Raleigh's colonial ventures, and the Armada's defeat were recalled not merely as events, but as defining stories of what it meant to be English. They became touchstones for identity, invoked in times of crisis and triumph alike. To later generations, they represented the moment when England turned outward, when the sea became the stage upon which the nation's destiny was written. This myth-making was more than nostalgia. It provided a cultural foundation for empire, shaping the way the English understood their past and justified their future. The age of Elizabeth and the early Stuarts was cast as a heroic beginning, a time when boldness and faith had launched a kingdom toward greatness. Even when later realities were more complex, when profit and power outweighed idealism, the memory of these early exploits offered a narrative of purpose. The consequences of this transformation reached far beyond England's shores. In the Americas, the first permanent settlements laid the groundwork for societies that would evolve into new nations. In Africa, trading posts became part of a system that connected 3 continents. In Asia, the East India Company planted the seeds of what would become the most enduring sphere of British influence. The world itself was being bound together by England's sails, its goods, and its ambitions. At home, the impact was equally profound. A new economy emerged, based not on feudal dues, but on commerce, finance, and global exchange. A new class of merchants and investors gained wealth and influence, reshaping politics and society. The English imagination was changed as well, filled with images of distant lands and new horizons. The idea of England as a nation of the sea became not just rhetoric, but reality. Yet the legacy was not without its tensions. Dependence on overseas trade made England vulnerable to rivals. Religious divisions at home found echoes in the colonies. And the profits of empire carried social and moral costs that would grow more visible over time. Still, in the 17th century, the prevailing sense was one of momentum, of a nation propelled outward by opportunity and necessity alike. Looking back, it is clear that this was more than a chapter in English history. It was the beginning of a global story. From the wooden decks of caravels and galleons, from the smoke of Virginia tobacco and the spice markets of Asia, England forged the pathways of empire. What had once been a small island kingdom emerged as a power whose horizons stretched across oceans. The voices of the past remind us of the scale of this transformation. The victories over the Armada, the daring voyages of Drake, the ambitions of Raleigh, and the endurance of Jamestown were not isolated events. They were the first strokes in a painting that would cover continents. From exploration came settlement, from settlement came empire. And from empire came a vision of England as a nation whose history could no longer be told within the bounds of its shores. The story of this age lives on, not only in archives and monuments, but in the enduring idea that a people once limited by their island geography could imagine the world as their stage. It is a story of ambition and resilience, of ventures that faltered and others that flourished, of a kingdom that discovered its power upon the seas. From small wooden ships upon the open ocean, England began a journey that would change the world.